Hi, friends. How are you doing? I am so happy to have you in this space with me. As most of you know, this is Cultivate Your Mental Wealth, where together we go on a journey from mental illness, especially as it relates to anxiety and depression, to mental wellness, and from mental wellness to a place of mental abundance. What do I mean by that? I believe that all of us are designed to live in the overflow. Your journey towards wellness isn't just for you. Your freedom and wellness is attached to those around you. And if you can get in a place of mental health and mental abundance, you can live in the overflow so that your people in your community can also get to a place of wellness. I can't help but smile about that because it is probably the most exciting thing about my purpose, making sure Black people get to a place of mental health and mental abundance. Wellness isn't just for us, it is for those around us too. So, my name is Joyce Chineye Ozeh. I am a first generation Nigerian American. I am also a civil rights attorney in Chicago. It's lighter here for those of you who are outside of the US. We did have daylight savings, so you can finally kind of see outside. It's not so dark. But not only do I do civil rights law in Chicago, I am also a mental health advocate. And I have lived experience with mental health, specifically anxiety and depression. And thankfully, I am no longer in a space where those two identities or labels define who I am. I'm in a place of mental health, and that's where I want to get you all to. So, what can you expect from today's segment? We are going to be talking about the stigma surrounding mental health in the Black community. I also love interacting with you, so we're going to do a couple audience check-ins. Let me know where you're watching from. And one of the questions that I want to follow up with when we get to this part is, what are some of your fears surrounding mental health? Or what are some of the stigmas around mental illness that you heard of growing up? We will also talk about what you can expect next time on the show, and then we'll wrap it up with some practical pushes. Sound good? I hope so. Okay, so for our first audience check-in, Rhonda, I'm so happy to see you. Margaret, how are you doing? Again, I'm going to be checking in with you later on in the show. So let me know, what are the stigmas surrounding mental health and mental illness that you heard growing up? And what are your fears when it comes to mental illness? We all have them. This is a judgment-free zone. So let's open up and share freely. Walmart, thank you so much for joining in with us. I will check in with you a little bit later. And as you all know, what I like to do before we get into the meat of our discussion, or the tofu for those of you who are meatless, I like to set the room. I like to talk about our expectations. So this is a discussion, yes, but this is also a space where we can cultivate wellness. You are safe here. This is a space for you. Feel free to share your stories, share any questions, share concerns, or even challenge something that's been said. We're here together. This is a journey we're in together, and we are in the trenches together. You are so safe, and I am so happy to have you with us. Okay, so stigmas surrounding mental illness in the Black community. I can't even begin to cover them all, but I want to talk about the origins of stigma. We already know stigma exists, and it doesn't just exist in the Black community, but this is our primary focus, and the way it exists in the Black community is especially unique because of our historical lens, especially in this country. The reason we're talking about the stigmas of mental illness in the Black community, and especially its origins, is you can't heal from or get free from something you don't understand. You don't know where you're going unless you look back. So to understand mental illness and the barriers our people face, we have to understand where it all originated from. Where did it come from? And again, there are a myriad of reasons why stigma exists in the Black community, but I wanted to highlight the most prominent. As I was doing my research and reading more into why mental illness and mental health is so stigmatized for our people, I learned that a lot of the stigma is actually rooted in slavery. Did you know that? So much of the stigma surrounding mental illness can find its origins in slavery. And it all started with the breaking down of the psyche of a Black person. Now, without having to get too graphic, Black people, as we all understand, but it's important to revisit, we were treated as property and not humans. And I want us to really think about the underestimated effects that that could have on someone's mind. In order to enslave someone, it starts with the mind and not the body. You have to break a person's mind down in order to get them to fear you, to follow you, and to listen to you. So, what happened is that when African people were brought to this country, their minds were the first things that were attacked. Their minds were broken down, their identities were erased, their last names were changed, and their languages, their native languages, were prohibited, which is why we have a lot of like broken English. And even as Black people, we have our own vernacular because we had to learn to forget our native languages and adopt a language that wasn't made for us and communicate in that language proficiently in order to survive as a slave in this country. Now, more than just breaking on the psyche of a person, a Black person, which contributes to mental illness, the stigma really started to come because it was commonly thought in the 1600s, during the time of African American slavery, that enslaved people were not sophisticated enough to develop mental illness, just as depression, anxiety, or other mental health disorders. Can you believe that? It was actually believed that a Black person's brain wasn't elevated enough to have mental illness. Why is this important to understand? That idea of mental illness was disassociated and not attributed to Black people. So, fast forward to present day for a moment. If way back when in this country, we weren't thought of as being sophisticated enough to have mental illness, when people are actually experiencing mental illness today, there is already a history of disassociation, meaning there's already a history of saying mental illness isn't for us. I've often heard it even said that's a white person's illness or that's a white person's disease. When really, if you look at the statistics, Black people experience mental illness and mental health issues at similar rates to their white counterparts. So we already know that it's not true that that's a white person disease. But it started in history and it started in slavery with this idea that our minds couldn't develop mental illness in the way a white person's minds do. Obviously, scientifically, that has been debunked. There is no difference between a Black person's brain and a white person's brain. But that first seed was planted in slavery. Now let's move to post-slavery. Thankfully, there was the abolition of slavery, but that was only on the books, right? And post-Civil War, there was a lot of economic disenfranchising. What do I mean by disenfranchising? That's just a big way of saying oppression or deprivation. Black people were economically oppressed and deprived from finances and resources in order to build wealth. So even though on the books slavery was abolished, white people and white legislators still found a way to legislate or lawfully institute slavery. What did that look like economically? How many of y'all are familiar with sharecropping? Sharecropping happened when a white person would own a piece of land and they would rent out a parcel or a section of that land. And the way that a person would pay rent for that land wasn't through money. It was they would harvest and plant their seeds and crop and do all the hard work. And a portion of that harvest would go to the landowner. And that's how they paid rent for the land. I believe that this happened to a majority of poor Americans. They were sharecroppers, and about 1/3 of sharecroppers were Black people. After the Civil War, there was this idea of 40 acres and mules, where Black people who were free were able to be given 40 acres of land and a mule. That was legislated away from them. And a lot of Black people had to return the land that was given to them or face jail and violence, or even slavery. And what ended up happening was that in 1870, 30,000 Black people owned land out of the 4 million people that didn't. And what happened is there was actually lawful slavery, and they called them laborers under that sharecropping that I talked of, which forced people to return their land and sign annual labor contracts saying that I will rent this land from you by giving you a portion of my crop. And they had to renew those contracts every year. And if they didn't, they could face jail time and, I'm sure, physical violence and even death. So why am I talking about economic oppression when we're supposed to be talking about stigmas as they relate to mental illness? You can't separate the two. By forcing Black people after slavery, after the Civil War, which Black people fought for, and after the abolition of slavery, to then be laborers, which was its own form of slavery because they weren't being paid fairly, and it restricted their way to have upward mobility and economic independence and freedom. Imagine the toll that takes on your mind and not just your body. So not only were you no longer someone who was able to own themselves, but even when they told you you're free, they found ways to make sure that you never stayed free. So you were working a land that was no longer yours, that was taken back from you after given to you. And you were also given a ceiling where you couldn't go past the ceiling because of your Blackness. And you were expected to overcome the very present history of slavery and overcome having to work this land and function as a part of society as if that wasn't going to affect your mental health. So imagine going through all of that and then sitting back and saying, I wonder if I have anxiety, or I wonder if I have depression. All this to say is, when you're looking at the economic oppression that Black people faced, there was no longer the luxury to ask yourself, what is the effect on my mind that all of this is having? Because Black people existed in a time where survival was the only option. Survival was the norm. And when you are in survival mode, you don't get to evaluate and assess what the effects of these systems of oppression are having on your mind. So what a lot of people in the Black community in the 1800s and even through the 1960s with the civil rights movement and everything that was going on, a lot of people started to talk about mental illness in other terms. They call them nuanced terms. And they would talk about it like stress and just being tired. Because after working all day, after fighting to exist as a human being, after fighting to grow in economic mobility, stress and being tired were the only words that they were willing to attribute to what was happening to them mentally. So when we are in survival mode, and instead of calling something anxiety and depression, you call it stress and fatigue, you are changing language so that you no longer have to face head on what is actually happening. And I also want to go to the fact that a lot of people, especially during that time, didn't have the same access to psychiatrists and psychologists as their white counterparts in that time. So some Black people in that time didn't even have the language to explore or understand what was happening to their minds. And again, they didn't have the resources to associate what was happening to them as the same diagnoses that white people faced. You understand? So this is how stigma is born. You are not given the same opportunities as other people. You are constantly receiving attacks and traumas to your mind because of what you're experiencing. And other people are telling you that you don't deserve to experience what you're experiencing. So then you normalize it. You call it by a different name. You shy away from it. And by normalizing mental illness, by calling it stress and fatigue, you end up thinking that if it's just stress, then I can just work harder. If I'm just tired, I can just get over it. And you begin to think that having mental illness means that you're being selfish, that you're being soft, that you're being weak. All of these things contribute to a stigma. And this is a stigma that I believe has plagued the Black community. We were never given the space to explore the things our minds need to thrive and to grow. And that stigma has passed from generation to generation, which is a little bit of what we'll be talking about in 2 weeks. But as all of us know, systemic oppression still exists today. In fact, although in other ways, Black people experience mental illness at the same rates that their white counterparts, at their Hispanic counterparts, some communities in the Black community at large experience high rates of PTSD. And some communities in Black community experience PTSD at the same rates as people who have fought wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm talking about Black children who experience PTSD at the same rates as people who have actually fought in war. This isn't going anywhere, and that stigma still exists. But what I want to do, and what I want to encourage us all to do, is to understand the effects and the impact that mental health has on our conditioning. I want us to understand the effects and the origin based on history and that context that mental health has, and why that stigma still exists. Stigmas happen when there is a lack of understanding of mental illness, and that is through ignorance and misinformation. And this is also because people have a lot of negative views that have become popular. How many of y'all have seen TV shows that talk about crazy people? So my husband grew up in Nigeria, and a lot of the people that have mental illness that he saw were people who didn't have homes, people who were experiencing homelessness. People who have mental illness in Nigeria are thought of as people who run around naked, don't have homes, uttering gibberish. When really, that's misinformation. Sometimes mental health can be on a spectrum where you're so ill that you no longer can keep a job. But there are people around you, Black people who are struggling with mental illness, that can keep jobs, that can have coherent conversations, that are not weak. We talked about Black figures on our last show. I encourage you to look at that clip, just because I want us to put a face to these issues when we're talking about it. But I want us to think about how those stigmas have impacted our understanding of mental illness. Again, I encourage you all to share any of the stigmas that you heard growing up when it comes to mental illness. Mental illness is for weak people. Mental illness means you're crazy. There are tons of shows that talk about people with mental illness that are murderous, that are psychopaths and sociopaths, and they must kill people. That's all sensationalization. And we need to call it by name in order to understand the impact of these stigmas in our community. So I want to say that if there is one thing that you take away from our discussion today, it's that when we live in fear, fear of what people may think, fear of the stigma surrounding mental illness, fear of where we come from and the history of mental illness in the Black community. When you live in fear, it keeps you uninformed, it keeps you isolated, and it keeps you sick. One of the reasons why systems of oppression against communities, especially Black people, can remain or were birthed is misinformation. A lot of slave owners kept Black people illiterate and uneducated because they knew the power that came with information and resources. Fear keeps you from information and resources. Fear keeps you from reaching out to community. Fear keeps you sick. And what I'm challenging you today is to say that you were designed for more than fear. You were designed to live well, and not just live well, but to actually be well. Okay? You don't have to be who you've always been. If I've said it once on the show, I will say it again. And you don't have to stay in your sickness. There are resources available to you. There is community available to you. And there is a way towards freedom and healing and wellness that's available to you. Let that be your takeaway. Let us understand where we're coming from so we can know where we're going. And let us face those fears and those stigmas head on so that we can know how to address them and go to healing. So I want to do some audience check-ins because I love interacting and communicating with you. Hi, Camille from New Jersey. Hi, TL from Ohio. I love anyone from the Midwest. It's where I spent most of my life. Hello, Letha from New Jersey. I love that you called in. Carol from Maryland. Belle from Connecticut. Dervell from Newark, New Jersey. Belle, I'm so glad that you are here and that you are appreciating this conversation. It's not always easy to talk about the trauma of slavery, but I do believe that our community is resilient. And in talking about it and understanding it, we understand how we were told to think about some things and where we can go. We don't have to be or listen to what we've been told. We're allowed to be free. Yes, Carolyn, we are told that we should just pray it away. I am going to have an entire show dedicated to mental illness and religion. I don't believe that fundamentally mental wellness and religion are at odds. What I disagree with is this notion that God can't work through therapists. I disagree with the notion that God can't work through medication if you need it. I disagree with the notion that God cannot use doctors. So when we are called to pray about our mental illness and pray about our mental health, God sends people to help us. God sends people to help us process. And I believe what false religion tells you, I can only speak about my experience, so I'll say false Christianity tells you, is that you can't pray and also seek treatment. Let's get into that in our segment about religion and mental illness because there's a lot to unpack there. And I think that there are a lot of lies. And I think that spirituality and God can coexist with mental wellness. But yes, we are told we should just pray it away. And if we close our eyes, it'll go away. And that isn't necessarily true. And I do believe that at times false religion has contributed to ignorance, while not, because again, false religion has kept us in fear of seeking the help that we need, and we don't deserve that. So please, please stay tuned for our segment on religion and mental illness. More specifically, the big church, capital C, the church and mental wealth and mental health. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. And we are going to talk about what's happening in 2 weeks. So on Tuesday, March 28th, I want to talk about intergenerational trauma and its effects on our mental health. Intergenerational just means trauma that we pass on from generation to generation without even knowing it, or sometimes while knowing it, and how that can affect our mental health and how we can break free from intergenerational trauma. We don't have to carry on what our ancestors carried on. We are allowed to be our ancestors' wildest dreams and to walk in healing and freedom. But this is a part of the show that I really love, and that's when I give you practical pushes on how to explore mental health and mental abundance. Stay tuned. Let's thrive. So, the last time we talked about practical pushes, I talked about how it's important to reflect on your story so that you can share your experience, your testimony, your story with others. Because again, our healing is not for us. Our healing is so that those around us, those we love, can also be well. Now, some of you may struggle with reflection, and I'm going to let you in on a secret. I'm not that good at meditation. I am not that good at just being still and meditating. I like to kind of like be playing music or running around or doing something, but being quiet is a struggle. Everything I share with you is a part of my journey, so I wouldn't share it if I don't believe in it. And what I'm sharing with you is something really excited that I've been practicing and a discipline that I've been growing. And that is how to reflect by using journal prompts. So, for those of you who want to meditate, who want to find wellness in writing things down but don't know where to start, my reflection points for you are through 3 journal prompts that I want you to put into practice this week. Get your journals out and let's get prompting. The first prompt is, what is an honest belief or fear that you carry when it comes to mental illness? And I say honest because we live in a culture of like political correctness where we're not allowed to be honest about what we feel. And I believe in respecting and honoring and valuing other people. I also believe in meeting yourself exactly where you're at. You don't have all the right answers, and that's okay. What are you honestly afraid of when it comes to mental illness? And what are some stigmas that you actually believe? Write it down. The second prompt is, where did you first hear that belief? What is the origin of that stigma? I like reflecting on this, and I'm going to share a little something personal. When I told my mom years ago that I was struggling with anxiety and depression, she told me, don't say that. Don't call it depression. Say that you're tired. Say that you're stressed out. Because if you call it anxiety, if you call it depression, people are going to think you're crazy. And that's when I realized, oh my goodness, this stigma of mental illness, it's not starting from my mother, but it's supported through my mother. So, where did you first hear the stigma of whatever false belief surrounding mental illness that you hold? What is its origin? And your third journal prompt is, what is a new belief about mental illness that you can adopt to challenge your old belief? What is a new belief about mental illness that you can adopt to challenge your old belief? This is arguably the most important of the journal prompts because in order to change your limited beliefs, you have to adopt a new belief that would challenge your limiting beliefs. And what I had to adopt was telling my mother, by calling anxiety by name, I am not telling the world that I am crazy. I am actually giving myself the freedom to face anxiety head on and adopt a new belief, meaning I can get well from this thing. I wasn't born to be stressed. God has designed me to be fierce, bold, courageous, and fearless. And anxiety is limiting me. So if I call this anxiety, I can name it, I can face it, and I can overcome it. And that's exactly what happened for me. And that's exactly what I want to happen for you. So explore these prompts. What's a fear that's been limiting you about mental illness? What is the origin of that fear? And what is a new belief that you can adopt to challenge it? That is all I have for you folks. Please continue to ask questions. I will follow up on our Facebook page at blackdoctor.org, their Facebook page, if you have any other questions that I couldn't address. Until then, go and thrive. You deserve it.